as the invasion had kicked off, within the very first minutes of it, as the PLA's 48th Infantry Division along a 17-mile-long front raced across the border, rapidly doing so, but having to travel through rubble-choked streets from their very initial artillery bombardment, which was extremely heavy, not only by their own artillery battalions, of which they had 2 within the 48th ID, but also from the 148th Artillery Brigade as well. Not to mention the missile strikes occurring in the suppression of enemy air defense operation, which was occurring on the base itself within its training areas, with 3 different nations firing enormous quantities of missiles initially at these air defense forces, as well as American motor pools, command and control centers, even certain living areas as well. And, of course, it's Biggs Army Airfield, where normally its aviation brigade would be located. However, this was away on its European deployment, as previously mentioned. As literally at the same time as the enormous fighting broke out by the I-10 corridor within the city and its downtown and slightly outside of it within its suburbs, the Americans' 3rd Brigade of the 1st Armored Division had tried in vain, fully knowing that this was an invasion and a border crossing, although not aware of the Trojan aspect of it per se, as these forces were all loaded up in their vehicles with live ammunition, preparing to do training operations within the base as a show of force and readiness. They were instead diverted by their command out to make a vain attempt to stop the cross-border invasion, which was already occurring within minutes as civilians and remaining vehicles not yet destroyed by the artillery or the crossfire now occurring raced to warn American troops manning the gates of the installation that such was occurring, a full-scale invasion. All as they were already aware, as within just the first 15 minutes, hundreds of artillery howitzers and rockets, shells from howitzers and rockets from the rocket projectors, landed all throughout the city and installation itself of Fort Bliss, which is adjacent also to the White Sands missile testing range. Literally multiple parts of this battle were occurring all at one time, so covering them in a coherent order would literally be impossible at this point, as in the previous video, we explored the combat being conducted by the 48th Infantry Division and its subunits of its different mechanized infantry battalions, its combat engineer battalion, its 2 armored battalions, and of course its artillery, providing them artillery support. As fire missions were coming down relentlessly, as per the ISR capabilities, relaying data, which was then processed in turn by the best AI in the world, and also, as it was fed into combat data links, the FDCs, the fire direction control elements of these artillery batteries, which comprise these whole battalions of artillery, were putting out fire missions left and right. Some were precision operations, while others were just a broad barrage area saturation operation. As the battle unfolded, the Trojan units broke out of their CCP regime properties in the form of the Pakistani 14th Infantry Division, as Pakistan was an extremely close ally of China. Naturally, their use of CCP properties would be a prerequisite for their staging as a Trojan unit within the scope of this entire battle. Likewise, throughout the nation, it wasn't just Chi-Com units on these CCP properties as Trojans within the country, as their allies, all of which were allowed to operate off of these CCP properties, although China naturally provided the lion's share of all the forces involved at 10 million of the 12.5 million troops, the other 2 million being Russian and the other 500,000 being from various other nations. As the fighting was now hitting a fever pitch, only within hour number 1. In the last video, what we explored was this armored battalion right here on the Rio, along with this mechanized infantry battalion right here and right here, with one more mechanized infantry battalion clearing the flanks and moving through the suburbs to handle any survivors of the artillery barrage who were completely shaken and shell-shocked if they did manage to survive the barrage. They cleared the armed civilians from the eastern flank, while in the previous video, this armored battalion and this mechanized infantry battalion went straight up the center, likewise clearing some armed civilian resistance of reactionary armed civilians before clashing at the interstate, as wresting control over the interstate was of vital importance to the invaders for logistical reasons as much as it pertained to their full invasion plans, insofar as it related to the external components using these highways as arteries to invade the nation. So naturally, smashing the 3rd Brigade of the 1st Armored Division was a high priority for the 14th Group Army, which was an external component of this larger invasion, and this battle in particular being the fist that punched and broke its way across the border, along with the 18th PAP in the far west, doing their part to clear the flanks on the west of this operation, with a special operations sub-operation occurring, with the Stalking Leopard Special Operations Battalion being literally picked up by the entire transportation helicopter battalion of the 141st Aviation Regiment, and its combination of Z-20 utility / transport helos such as so, flying with the smoldering and being shelled city of El Paso in the background and the Rockies beyond there, flying their Z-20s full of troops as well as their Z-8s, as they had some Z-8 companies, as the Z-20 was mostly a newer helo that was operated largely by the active PLA military, although being that they were now being mass-produced in such enormous numbers, they naturally were beginning to proliferate through the reserves who had aviation assets, such as the 14th PLA Group Army, which was an extremely well-equipped force of the PLA reserves, mobilized to do their part in the invasion. As the other forces of the 141st Aviation, its attack helicopter battalion, and its armed reconnaissance helicopter battalion, both flew together to conduct operations against a rapidly emerging threat of armed civilians in the northern and western portion of the city, as well as other companies within these attack and armed reconnaissance battalions splitting up to aid local Trojans consisting of a combat engineer battalion and mechanized infantry battalion of the Pakistani 14th Infantry Division, who were smashing their way not just across the outermost portions of El Paso, but into the main post itself, where they clashed with local American units consisting of the 1st Armored Division's 2nd Brigade, immediately clashing with elements of its Cav Battalion, which consisted of 2 rifle companies, 2 heavy companies, an artillery company, and a headquarters and support company, as well as an armored battalion, which was essentially a tank battalion in the main post here. They smashed their way through the fencing with no issues at all, as again, American installations were very poorly defended, mostly often consisting of just an outer chain link fence, sometimes not even topped with any concertina wiring, just simple barbed wire strands. Occasionally, there would be areas that would have stronger brick or other types of walls, but for the most part, these installations were nothing but a chain link fence surrounding a mass of buildings. And by this point, many of these buildings and motor pools, the airfield, even living areas had been smashed to total rubble by the Chinese PHL-03 battalion firing its enormous 300mm rockets and salvos, along with long-range 155mm satellite-guided WS-35R rocket-assisted satellite-guided projectiles, which had a 37-mile range, or just regular rocket-assisted ammunition, which wasn't satellite-guided but could just hit his target anyway due to the exact coordinates being relayed to the FTC, who in turn sent the fire mission down to the gun line. The installation is by now being heavily pummeled by, again, everything from missiles to artillery, as well as even tank shells and armed helicopters of the attack and armed reconnaissance varieties, as well as strike aircraft in the form of MiG-31s who, due to being so far away from the loitering munitions support, as this was a 100 by 100 mile area, the 48th and their headquarters battalion, who had a couple drone sections, dedicated drone sections within it, who would fire these TEL-like systems of 48 tubes apiece of their CH-901A loitering munitions. From where they sat currently, across the Rio, in the outer suburbs of Juarez, their loitering munitions would only be able to make it just to the international airport and main post area in order to aid the Pakistani Trojans, as well as all their own troops currently engaged in heavy, mortal combat within the city itself of El Paso. While further out, Trojan forces of the 14th Infantry Division of Pakistan would receive generous air support from the local Russians in the form of their one strike squadron dedicated to just this area of MiG-31Ks, which also likewise participated in the SEAD operations by each one firing a Kinzhal, a KH-47. Also, there were Su-57s that were primarily tasked with the air superiority mission, but finding no American aviation assets, as most were by this point within the first opening hour, already being smashed or their installations overrun by Trojans. Finding no American enemies in the skies, they would fly ground support operations in the form of strafing ground targets or dropping their 2 laser-guided 500-pound munitions that each aircraft carried, while the rest of their munitions were air-to-air munitions due to their role as fighters operating in their specific role at the opening of the invasion. Although they would eventually do an RTB, a return to base, and they would refit with ground attack munitions to add even more weight to the air threat from the skies against the American ground forces. As the fighting raged on, and the 2 battalions, the Armed Recon and Attack Battalion from the 141st Aviation Regiment, were now hovering over the skies of western El Paso, suppressing armed civilians as well as aiding their Pakistani Trojan brethren within the operation, as well as aiding their own troops. The fighting that proceeded here on the far eastern end in the last video was as such, as the Americans were observing a great many cruise missiles, recon drones, aircraft, and loitering munitions in the skies, as well as the heavily armored fist of the local, in the eastern sector, the local Chi-Com armored battalion, along with its very potent mechanized infantry, who operated the powerful ZBD-04A infantry fighting vehicles, as well as their heavy machine gun turret-equipped 12.7 millimeter machine guns. These forces, with the Type 99A main battle tanks and their QN-506 brand new multi-purposed tank-busting vehicles, which could also double at firing at air targets, and of course, like their HJ-10 equipped AFT-10s, they can also fire at clusters of infantry. But as opposed to how the AFT-10 was a longer range, very long range anti-tank missile system, and it was very large and very powerful, the QN-506, its main primary weapon, was able to fire at a 3.7 mile range, nearly 4 miles, and it was extremely powerful against armored vehicles, as it could penetrate easily 1,000 millimeters of rolled homogeneous steel armor, which was the metric by which vehicle armor was judged as far as how powerful and strong it was. But there was ample combat in this sector, and on the other flanks, the armed helos of the 141st Aviation played their role in this exact battle, which this particular sector, with the one armored battalion from the 48th Infantry Division, as well as its mechanized infantry battalion committed to just this sector on the eastern end of the city, with an additional mechanized infantry battalion clearing the suburbs on the far eastern end. On the western end was where the armed helicopter battalions struck, and struck viciously. With air defense being a major consideration in modern warfare, over the years, helicopters have taken somewhat of a backseat, although they weren't completely relegated to the dustbin of history, as they still were fully capable of dominating the modern battlefield so long as the enemy they were fighting did not possess capable layered air defense, which America did not, as they operated a very patchy network of air defense systems, and they never poured quite the amount of money into air defense that China or Russia had, as well as some other nations as well on that list, who took air defense exceedingly serious, whereas the United States had a very large helicopter fleet. China and Russia likewise had very large helicopter fleets by 2024 and beyond, although not quite as emphasized as the emphasis Americans put into theirs. They still, nonetheless, played a major role in this invasion, as America did not have any air defenses that could contend with these threats, aside from shoulder-fired Stinger surface-to-air short-range missiles. But with the SEAD, or suppression of enemy air defense operations, having had occurred, and the one air defense battalion that was part of the Divisional Artillery Brigade of the 1st Armored Division that was training in Fort Sill, was not present at this battle, and they operated Stinger-based systems. And due to them being in Fort Sill at the time, were not able to fire at these attack helicopters. This battle occurring here on the far western flank of the American 1st Armored Division's 3rd Brigade was an engagement between two subordinate comprising armored companies of its 3rd Brigade's local armored battalion in the area on the far west of the American lines here, adjacent to the highway, and the helicopters were roughly a mile away, providing ample fire support against American forces coalescing on the main post of the 2nd Brigade of the 1st Armored Division, as well as providing fire support to the 48th Infantry Division, who was advancing along their 17-mile front into the city's outer suburbs and the downtown itself. With the attack helicopters having already neutralized armed civilians in the opening minutes of the invasion, along with friendly artillery fire from 3 PLL 66 152 battalions that belonged to the 148th Artillery Brigade. The mixture of fire from these potent attack and reconnaissance helicopters mixed with the 152 millimeter artillery fire into this western portion of the city utterly crushed armed civilian bands everywhere they appeared in the city. The barrages came on extremely heavy, leaving, by the battle's end, most of the city in complete and total ruination, with very few buildings that weren't completely either knocked down into a pile of rubble or damaged from nearby munitions or pockmarked and shredded by very strong autocannon fire or heavy machine gun fire. The city would resemble Berlin in 1945, as would most other American cities by the time the 4-day invasion was even over with. El Paso, certainly not an exception to this rule. As within this picture, a snapshot of the fighting, an image truly is worth 1,000 words, as the saying goes. Severed limbs were also likewise a common sight in the fighting, as munitions blasted, heavy machine guns shredded men to pieces, and more. By the time this engagement occurred, again, on the far western edge of the American lines, these two American tank companies on guard within this area, trying to push out their perimeter and scout the area, as they had no ISR capabilities. Their intent was to look for a hole in the Chi-Com lines to escape the area, as by only 45 minutes into the fighting, the situation was already so desperate, and many runners were cut down trying to deliver information between different commanders of these different elements. It got to a point to where company captains began having to take the initiative and make their own executive decisions regarding the status of their units and their intended future planning as it related to ad hoc on-the-spot planning. And as these two armored companies pushed out in neighborhoods adjacent to I-10, which ran just to the south of these American forces. They were promptly engaged by CH-901A loitering munitions with heat warheads, high explosive anti-tank, fired by the headquarters battalion's drone elements of the 48th Infantry Division, which were partially operator-operated but could be set on AI targeting mode, which in this case the AI targeting mode was selected as volleys of these drones were needing to be fired due to the heavy nature of the enemy they faced, as these American forces were a full armored division and were very heavily equipped as such, insofar as the vehicle types they wielded and the capabilities of these vehicles should they have opportunities to even get shots off. However, in this instance, these armed helicopters, both the reconnaissance and attack helicopter varieties, being the Z-19 attack helicopter companies within their attack battalion, as well as the quite heavily armed reconnaissance helicopters, the Z-11WA versions. And this particular company here of these helicopters is a Z-19 attack helicopter company spread out in a line here, as well as elements of another company that passed through the area, along with other elements further back, as again, this is only a small snapshot of a much larger area and a much larger battle occurring, with this company tasked out with destroying these two American armored companies, along with the CH-901As in this area. As you can see, artillery had already flattened these neighborhoods before these American forces began to move through the area, as they originally had left the installation with the intent to push the invaders back across the Rio. But the fist of the invasion, the battering ram, the knife stabbing into the heart of the area, plunged in with no recourse for these forces. Yes, these forces, with their exceptionally effective M1A2 main battle tanks, as well as Bradley IFVs, as it related to the mechanized infantry elements, rifle companies and such, they did produce some Chi-Com casualties. Although in the grand scheme of things as it stood, these casualties were extremely minor in the scope and scale of the whole invasion, even of the whole forces attacking this area. Yes, there would be a vehicle lost here, a vehicle lost there. 2 QN-506s were even destroyed in the last battle. But that was only a drop in the bucket. There were also Chi-Com KIAs and WIAs among their dismounted infantry, a few lost APCs. But in return, the Americans lost far more, far faster. As this is war, and in real life, even a highly disadvantaged enemy can still get a few shots off and do a little bit of damage, although in the grand scheme of things, the Americans found themselves in the exact same position that the Iraqi army found themselves in Desert Storm, as the Iraqi army at that time lacked ISR superiority. They lacked air support. It was minimal to non-existent, similar to the air power at the initiation of the invasion, as there were some American patrolling fighter aircraft, but these were all annihilated in the opening minutes of the fighting, as scores of coalition aircraft flew over American airspace and engaged anything they saw airborne in the skies. Similar happened to the Iraqis, and as they lost their eyes and ears, proverbially speaking, they lost their radar networks, they lost their ability to defend their airspace, Their ground forces suffered as a result. But added to this was the Trojan dimension of the conflict, as well as the loitering munitions, FPV drones, and other newer, more innovative weaponry that hadn't either been used en masse before in warfare to such a degree or hasn't even been used yet at all. And the combination of conventional means and newer weaponry and technology, with the fact that the Americans were deaf, dumb, and blind, having lost their ISR capabilities, meant that their casualties were extremely morbid. And most of their WIAs, or wounded in actions, ended up as POWs, where they would receive medical care and humane treatment, as they were seen as honorable for suffering in battle their injuries. In the Chinese culture, this was an honorable thing. But even the PLA was quite humane in terms of dealing with POWs and properly fed and cared for these men, although they were subject to CCP regime propaganda while in captivity, and those who could work were put to work. As this unfolded, some of the buildings within this area, some rows of homes along with the fencing down these streets here, were still intact as they hadn't have yet been hit by shells, missiles, rockets, or anything else. But most of the artillery fire had leveled the vast majority of this area into complete and total rubbled ruination. And buildings like these that temporarily survived would be smashed in due time due to the combination of all the crossfire, as well as the new barrages that would be levied upon areas that hadn't have yet been struck by artillery, just to ensure that any conceivable resistance could be smashed, as at this time, further to the east, within the main fighting in downtown, many dismounted infantry forces were running from whatever remaining buildings remained and fighting inside of them as buildings were fought over, rubble piles were fought over. This ended up ensuring at times that artillery strikes, precision strikes, were called in on said buildings where American troops entered these buildings to take up fighting positions, or hit by loitering munitions, or hit by anti-tank missiles or other means, or tank shells, the powerful 125 millimeter main gun tank shells of the highly advanced Type 99A main battle tanks. These Z-19 attack helicopters had a large Doppler radome atop their rotary blades on the tops of these helos, with a millimeter wave radar suite mounted on the nose, which allowed for 360-degree battlefield awareness, as well as targeting and target tracking. Although the Z-19 carried 12 hardpoints for weapons, and it was ironic because the recon helicopters that were armed, the Z-11WAs, actually carried 16 hardpoints, the Z-19 more than made up for it by its incredible ability to stay airborne for a longer amount of time, as well as its maneuverability, although the Z-11WA had the Z-19 beat in the category of speed, as it was a much faster and smaller armed reconnaissance helicopter. The Z-19s attacked with their HJ-08 anti-tank missiles, each carrying 8 of them apiece, as well as firing, in some instances, their 2 57mm rocket pods attached, and these also had 2 23mm gun pods attached to their sides of their helos, which is where they carried their weaponry, even though it shows on the front. This is just symbolizing an attack helicopter in general, including with the gun. This just means that the gun pods are firing, which are like on the wings, but I do it like this as a symbol, sort of like the tanks all looking the same, just color-coded. But these were firing their HJ-08 anti-tank missiles in salvos, impacting and hitting these tanks right off the bat, while the others of this platoon right behind it are trying to go around the now destroyed tanks, only to be hit by further follow-up shots of HJ-08 precision anti-tank missiles. These CH-901A loitering munitions are already hitting these two vehicles here with their heat warheads, hitting this M88 armored recovery vehicle here. As these trucks, these LMTVs and this fueler truck and this other MRAP back here are trying to escape, they're going to be hit by rockets and HJ-08 anti-tank missiles, as well as other CH-901As that are off the map, as again, this is only a small segment of a larger battle occurring. This area is already being hit by 57mm rockets, as you see some are impacting here, some are impacting here, as well as HJ-08 anti-tank missiles being fired at these two tanks. The other two are now trying to retreat out of the area as they're being engaged. You can see on the side and front, this one's being engaged here. And these headquarters forces up here are being engaged by rockets. These two command tanks of the headquarters platoon, they're being engaged by HJ-08 anti-tank missiles and rockets from rocket pod. This one firing its rocket pod. Two rocket pods, I'm sorry. They're impacting right here, smashing these trucks, these LMTV trucks, fuel truck, and MRAP with the blast radius. They destroyed a tank with the blast radius destroying this truck, hitting this MRAP in its rear as it was facing this way with its gunner to guard the rear of the platoon. And some of the shrapnel impacted the fuel truck and this other LMTV and this M88 armored recovery. The shrapnel from these HJ-08s blasting this command tank, these two LMTVs, they're retreating out of this segment of the battlefield. Likewise, you have dismounted forces being engaged by 23mm gun pod fire, which some of these 23mm rounds, upon impacting, are blasting, and they're eliminating some of the men already running. But they don't even all make it as they dismounted their vehicles and ran. They don't even all make it as this arrow is totally encapsulated in red, which means they've all been completely engaged and annihilated. So this squad worth of guys here, these 8 guys trying to run off the mini-map here out of this park where their headquarters platoon set up, are all engaged by 23mm gun pod fire and therefore eliminated. As these helos all lined up continue to fire their 23mm gun pods with blasting ammunition, their rocket pods, their HJ-08 anti-tank missiles, which were impacting lead tanks of these two tank platoons of this tank company here, as well as the CH-901 loitering munitions, destroying these command tanks of the headquarters platoon, like I mentioned earlier, hitting these tanks as they advance here, with more coming up. This tank platoon's totally annihilated by CH-901s. Most of this one's been picked apart by HJ-08 anti-tank missiles and CH-901 fire, as you see right here. This flies in and crashes into this tank and destroys it with its heat warhead. As all of this is occurring here, and other companies of the reconnaissance and attack helicopter battalions are flying a bit further afield here, they are aiding the Pakistani Trojan forces operating in the main post. And these forces rapidly hurried down the streets, the rubble-choked streets of the city, and smashed through the fencing with their lead companies already now engaging the American forces of the 2nd Brigade of the 1st Armored Division in heavy combat. As all of these events are occurring at roughly the same exact time, missiles are still being fired and impacting in large part the installation, again hitting vital targets such as motor pools, even whole areas of living areas, barracks, along with artillery doing the same. command and control, radar sites, and during the SEAD operations, as well as the actual air defense systems themselves, wiping out many of the unit's vehicles, although some of the brigades were already mounted up in their vehicles ready for live fire training, which was their saving grace during this invasion as far as them being able to even defend themselves even a little bit. Had they all been in their barracks and very few units training, this battle would have even been far worse than it already was for them. It was already substantially horrible due to lack of ISR, due to enemy superiority in vehicles, numbers of vehicles, quality and quantity, essentially, of their equipment, their total ISR dominance with their constellations worth of reconnaissance drones, their enormous amount of military satellites, not just China having the most in the world, but Russia now having the second most along with them, as Russia surpassed the United States due to America losing all of its satellites within the volley of anti-satellite weapons in terms of its military satellites, followed by commercial, as the military satellites were the first priority for the first volley at midnight of anti-satellite weapons. These anti-satellite systems were reloaded and continually fired until all American commercial and military satellites, which were vigorously tracked from the ground, were all knocked out of the sky. The fighting was still savage nonetheless, and the Americans had heart, and they put up a good fight. But even so, again, they were in the same position as the Iraqis in the 1991 Gulf conflict, and that too was a 4-day conflict, much the same as this, and this is only the opening hours. Following this other battle, occurring literally at the same time with the Pakistani Trojans breaking into the main installation, will be covered within the next video. Again, all of these events occurring at the same exact time. All of them. As the Trojans struck at the same time as the externals struck, at the same time as the missile barrages came in and hit CNC areas, command and control, whole neighborhoods of on-post housing even, the airfield where ordinarily the aviation assets of the 1st Armored Division would be, as well as all the training areas where all their air defense assets of the 11th Air Defense Artillery Brigade were set up for their mission of trying to guard this lane of skies by the border for force protection over their own installation. Battle was vicious, was savage, like all the battles in the opening of the invasion. Again, this is no exception here, as the city, within just an hour's time, going into hour number 2, was already unrecognizable compared to what it had once been only mere minutes before, as multiple rocket projectors and howitzers all opened fire at one time and saturated the city with munitions, in addition to loitering munitions, tank shells, IFV shells from 100mm cannons, and more. The next video continues with the simultaneously occurring fighting on the main post, whereby the same attack and reconnaissance helo battalions that smashed these two American armored companies near the interstate, near I-10, would likewise have other of their subordinate companies comprising these battalions firing their anti-tank missiles and other weaponry in support of their Pakistani Trojan shock army brethren operating from the 14th Pakistani Infantry Division, whose combat engineer battalion and one of their mechanized infantry battalions were now storming the main post. Simultaneously, as the fighting erupted from the 48th Infantry Division crossing the borders, PAPs, border crossing, even the most powerful element within the 14th, the 144th Armored Division, the heaviest unit of all, bypassing all the combat and going straight up to the interstate just to ensure that it was secured for the externals to all link up and follow behind this very potent unit, which wasn't even committed to the battle, but was simply utilized to secure the interstate and file up and lead the entire external prong in this area, while the other units secured the border area and the rest of I-10 in this sector and made sure that this American Regular Army post, this active military installation, was totally smashed along with the forces thereupon. This was again a very short battle overall, and the coalition had immense firepower which it brought upon this installation and its forces, its tenant units, as well as the American paramilitary border security forces, armed civilian forces, even armed civilian militia forces, which would be rapidly assaulted by the 14th Group Army's Special Operation Battalion, being carried into battle by its transportation helicopter battalion, dropped off mere miles from its target, its high-value target, which it was set to either eliminate or capture, to ensure that all civilian organized resistance within this area, adjacent to the highway especially, was suppressed, nullifying such a threat. There are many areas on this battlefield that will be gone over, as again, many occurrences were happening simultaneously or near simultaneously within just the first hour alone, as Trojan shock forces secured the outer perimeter of the installation to prevent any escape to the mountains, where possibly they could start some kind of prolonged guerrilla campaign as far as the military forces were concerned, as well as keeping them away from the vital interstate invasion artery of where I-10 and I-25 came together within Las Cruces. That was absolutely critical for the invaders. While the 48th Infantry Division came up from the south and secured its objectives and its segment of highway, the International Airport, and the southern portions of the installation, ensuring that there would be no more fleeing units coming from the north into the south to get away and on to the interstate or to cause problems in that area, while the PAP cleared the far western flank of this battle, driving deep into New Mexico. Then hour one, they were already 20 miles in, beginning to engage more armed civilian forces. This was a very large battle in terms of the dynamics involved. Again, not as many forces committed to this battle as there were to the Laredo one as far as it related to the Chi-Com and Russian coalition forces, but all of the fighting against the different American forces and the numerous American forces here made this a larger battle in terms of the overall combat that occurred itself. The next video will cover the Pakistani Trojan forces, these two battalions, the combat engineers and mechanized infantry, and their drive into the main post, supported by the same helicopter battalions gone over within this video.